Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I go over my round 7 game from the Washington Chess Congress. Now, if you followed the round 6 video, you know that I won my second game in the row against a FIDE master by the name of Vincent Say, and now I kind of had built that momentum that I was talking about a few rounds ago, trying to get, because I'd had those 3 draws in the early going in the tournament, and I was kind of frustrated, but now I'd won 2 in a row and was feeling pretty good. Now, my opponent in this one was a very strong player in his own right, international master Michael Mulyar, who's actually been one of the top 100 players in the U.S. for probably about 20 years now. I think he's from Colorado and actually teaches chess full-time as a private coach, but he's also a very, very active player, and I've actually seen him around the World Open and a lot of different Continental Chess Association tournaments that are run in the United States. So, very, very good player. And also, I knew he was a positional player. I had never played him before, I don't think at least. But I knew he played c4 and d4, knight f3, this type of non-e4 lines where he could try and get a controlled game. So I knew it would be a particularly difficult player to beat with black because he's, generally pretty solid. So tough task, but I was up for the challenge, and yeah, let's see what happened. So anyways, Michael opened with d4, and I played d5, and then after knight f3, I played knight f6, c4, and now e6, and this has kind of been standard fare for me for most of this year, is going for Queen's Gambit decline type of structures. Yeah, I wasn't too sure what Michael would go for, but here he actually decided to play g3. And almost immediately I was kind of annoyed and frustrated because the Catalan is an opening that I've actually struggled against quite a bit this year. And it's also just a very, very solid opening, solid positional line. Now, there are many different ways you could play against this with black. You could try to take on c4 and hold on to the pawn. You could play more positionally and try to just hold your structure in the center a little bit longer. But all in all, the position is actually very, very solid, and it's actually quite difficult to beat white in these types of structures. So, yeah. The other thing that I knew was that I'd actually had quite a tough time of it in the closed Catalan, which is typically what I go for with e6, d5, and c6. And I'd wondered if he'd actually seen any of those games I'd played in the closed Catalan in the 5 to 10 minutes he would have been able to prepare before this game. So, yeah, I just think the Catalan was a good choice, and I probably should not have invited this as a possibility. Anyways, after g3, I went bishop e7, and then after bishop g2, castles, and c6, we actually wind up getting to this closed Catalan structure that I'd actually struggled with for quite a bit this year. I can recall some really bad losses in this line with white this year. Once against David Burgess comes to mind. There's also some bad positions I survived, like the one against Gauri Shankar earlier this year. And the problem for me, actually, is that in the main lines, like the absolute main lines where you take on c4, white has a few ways to kind of kill the game. And so one of them is actually this knight e5 line. It's very, very difficult if, white just wants a draw for black to kind of force the issue here and get anything more than that after the very, very forcing knight c6, bishop takes e6, b takes e6, knight takes, and then knight takes e7. And these types of lines are just very, very difficult for black to seriously play for a win in when white is pretty much in good shape if they know a few moves from here. So that was one thing that was somewhat discouraging. And I didn't want to go for any super forcing lines, so I decided to play c6, in part because it was what I was really familiar with, but also because the lines are less forcing and the structures are a little bit more complicated because the pawn tension stays on the board for longer. So anyways, after c6, white played b3. This is actually interesting plan just to get to the bishop to this long diagonal as quickly as possible. An argument actually could be made that you don't need to play b3 because white could consider playing queen c2 and rook d1, or even queen c2 and knight c3, as has been played against me before this year. I believe David Burgess went queen c2 and rook d1. And ultimately, the point is that white is always trying to play e4 in the structure. If white gets an e4 without me getting any counterplay in the center, the position is just better for white because after exchanges on e4, I'm left with a questionable light-squared bishop, to say the least, against white's light-squared bishop reigning supreme on the long diagonal. And if I, of course, allow e4 and then don't capture, then e5 is a very serious move, and my knight is dislodged from f6, where it typically winds up going to e8 and has a tough time of it trying to get back in the game. And then from there, white generally gets good attacking chances with like h4, knight g5, building that kind of bridge to the h7 pawn, trying to deliver mate. And so those are the kinds of things that I'd been thinking about that are quite possible when you play the move queen c2. And I think b3 is, again, a move that's been played a ton, is a very popular move, but I actually don't think it's the most precise because basically you're just delaying the e4 plan, which is, basically what you should be going for. So anyways, after b3, I played b6, just trying to fianchetto relatively quickly. And after b6, bishop b2, I actually played bishop b7, just kind of, copying a little bit. And the idea for black in a lot of these structures is once black's fully developed, they're going to try and play for c5. And so in some circumstances, you want to play c5 before e4 actually comes on the board, because if you're able to do that, then e4 isn't a possibility anymore because the bishop is actually effectively lined up against the e4 square. And I thought that maybe in this particular position, because white had played b3 and bishop b2, I could get this particular move order in with bishop b7 and c5. Now, the one thing that's kind of annoying and frustrating with this closed Catalan system is that I actually have already played c6, and because I played c6, if I play c5, I'm going to wind up doing it in 2 moves. And that's the very, very annoying thing about this system, because an argument or a question could be asked, why don't you just play b6 right away? Well, the reason you can't play b6 right away is because there's pressure on this diagonal too quickly, and there's also a weakness on the c6 square. So you can't actually play b6 and then rush c5. And if you want an example of how badly these positions can go if you play b6 right away, look no further than the game I played in the last round of the New York International this year. I can't remember the opponent off the top of my head, but that was round 9 in the Road to Grandmaster series in the New York International tournament. And it was just a total disaster of an opening, and I was really lucky to draw. So the point is you actually play c6 because you have to cover this square and not allow the tactics along the long diagonal, and then you play b6 to actually get your bishop there on this diagonal, and then you can, that's a terrible arrow, and then you can actually play c5. But the point is that you have to waste 2 tempo to do it, and it's just very annoying. So anyways, after bishop b7, white played knight c3, getting back on track, eyeing this e4 square, looking to prepare it. And here I made quite an interesting decision to first start with knight bd7. Again, this is actually a normal move, so this isn't the interesting decision. This would be a normal move, just developing the pieces, getting closer to connecting the rooks. But now, after the move queen c2, here I made a very, very controversial and honestly kind of silly decision with the move c5. And the idea is clear. I mean, I'm trying to essentially break in the center before white gets an e4. And so you can see now e4 is actually an impossibility because I have 1, 2, 3 pieces on that square. And that would be enough to stop this e4 break because there would only be 2 defenders. But the problem is that I'm basically running into a pawn structure that is actually very, very pleasant for white. And the other thing is, because my rooks aren't connected yet, and honestly, I don't even have my rook on the c file to challenge the queen on c2 yet, it's really not justified to do this. So instead, what I should have played, which has actually been played dozens of times in this position by strong grandmasters, is the move rook c8. And the point is that you actually allow e4, and you wind up taking on e4 and playing c5. And in these positions, white is actually slightly better, and this is something that I really did not want to play, in part because of the queenside majority that white will have after an exchange of d and c pawns. So typically here, there's knight takes f6, and rook a d1. And then, yeah, I could play a move like c takes d4, bishop takes d4, and queen c7. And the issue for black a lot of the time in these structures is that white has this 3-on-2 on the queen side, which is difficult to contend with, and black's kingside pawn majority is really nearly impossible to mobilize because e5 is firmly under white's control. And so my 4 versus 3 doesn't really become a factor until much later in the game, if at all. And, you know, white is able to use the space advantage and the queenside pawn majority to really put a lot of pressure on black. And there have been some nice games in the structure where white just, you know, executes a nice squeeze connected to controlling the e5 square and actually doubling rooks on the d file. So this was the kind of thing I wanted to avoid just because it was so unpleasant and I didn't have the details of that defense worked out. So instead, I played the move c5 to say, you know what, now you can't play e4 and the pawn structure is totally different. The issue here, though, is that after the very simple c takes d5, which Michael actually played, and then e takes d5, I'm in a very difficult position where I'm basically playing with hanging pawns and even the potential of having an isolated pawn at any moment. Now, you might say, why did you willingly play with isolated or hanging pawns? Why couldn't you play knight takes d5? Well, the reason knight takes d5 is actually not very good is because of knight takes d5. And if I play bishop takes, now there's e4. And the issue here is now white gets to take more space in the center with tempo. And after I move the bishop back to b7, there's actually just rook a d1. And the queen is actually extremely uncomfortable here on the same line as the rook on d1. And, you know, white is just for choice here. So I could also take with the e-pawn, but then in this particular version, white is, you know, still has the same features, of much better pawn structure in the position. But the other thing here is that we've also traded a pair of minor pieces. And typically when you have the worst pawn structure, or actually when you have a isolated pawn type of pawn structure, a hanging pawn structure, you want to play very dynamically because the one advantage you have in the position is your space. And so it's actually kind of paradoxical that white is actually the one that is quite happy to trade pieces because it nullifies any attacking chances that I have. And that's pretty much the gist of the position, is white is happy to play positionally, and I pretty much have to justify my initiative by trying to keep some pieces on the board. So that's why after c takes d5, I played e takes d5, keeping all the minor pieces on the board and at least giving me some chances to offset my weak structure with activity. But there are problems in this position, and, you know, white actually starts to take advantage of them right away. One of the real issues in my position is actually the f5 square. So there are a lot of times plans in this position where knight can sometimes get there with knight h4, knight f5, or even sometimes knight d4, knight f5, and that becomes a feature of the position. The other issue is just this diagonal can be opened whenever white actually wants because of this pawn tension on d4 and c5. And that will actually liberate the bishop on this long diagonal, and that's actually a huge problem for me to contend with. The last thing that I have to worry about is actually just pressure on the d5 pawn, because, again, white can play d takes c5 whenever, and, you know, with one of these rooks coming to d1, this d5 pawn really becomes under fire quite quickly, and it's just a tough position to contend with. The last thing I'll point out is actually my bishop on b7 being unprotected. Typically when bishops are lined up against each other on the same diagonal, the one that is actually protected is the one that's actually more secure. And so typically in queen's pawn openings, it winds up being white's white's kingside fianchettoed bishop being a much stronger piece than black's queenside fianchettoed bishop, because the queenside fianchettoed bishop is usually unprotected, and that means that tactically it can just be lost. And so if you can just imagine for a second, for instance, that this knight on f6 wasn't on that square and the diagonal was open and cleared, there'd be a very nice move, knight g5, threatening mate on h7, again, if the knight was not on f6, and uncovering the bishop on g2 to the one on b7. And those are the type of really sneaky tactics that start to emerge when you have unprotected pieces in your position. So those are all the factors that make this position much better for white. And I realized that, but I thought I might have some dynamic chances here. So anyways, after he takes d5, white played a very strong move, and I think actually quite instructive, the move rook a d1. And this was actually a move that surprised me considerably, because typically in queen's pawn openings, you're taught to put your rooks on d1 and c1. And so naturally, you'd think that this a rook should go to c1 so that the f rook can actually go to d1. But it's actually hugely important that Michael actually used the move order that he did, because what it means is that the f2 pawn actually still has valuable security from that rook on f1, and in a lot of positions, white's going to wind up playing d takes c5 to uncover pressure on the d5 pawn, and I'm going to be inclined to recapture with my bishop to eye the f2 pawn. And so if white actually played rook f d1, in many positions, there would be serious tactics after the bishop gets to c5 and knight g4 starts to become an idea. And so, for instance, let's say rook f d1, rook c8, and let's say d takes c5. Now, if bishop takes c5, I have all types of interesting threats. I have knight g4, I have knight e4, and then I also have discoveries on the queen on c2 because my rook is on c8. And so it's hugely important that the a rook comes to d1 so that the rook on f1 is still covering f2. And the other reason this is important is because it keeps the rooks connected. And you'll see this feature in a moment when you see white's next move, so I'll expand on this in a moment. So anyways, after rook a d1, I played rook e8. And this is actually another mistake on my part. A better move would have been to play rook c8 right away and essentially line the rook up against the queen on c2. I thought that rook e8 was a useful move and I would get the chance to play rook c8 later, but the point is that this is just more pressing. And white would still be better here after d takes e5 and knight takes c5, but at least my rook would already be on c8. Instead, after rook e8, white played the move d takes c5, and now I played the move bishop takes c5 because I was still entertaining the pressure against f2. And so you can actually notice that in the previous line I showed where the computer was actually recommending rook c8 before rook e8, it was taking with the knight. And the reason it was doing that is because it had kind of acknowledged that the f rook was still on f1. But I thought that really my only dynamic chance was taking with the bishop, so I decided to roll with that, even though I knew it meant that the d5 pawn was less secure, because essentially if I'd played knight takes c5, I would have had another defender on the d5 pawn. Anyways, after bishop takes c5, white played queen b1, and this is the other really brilliant reason why rook a d1 was such a better move. And the reason is you actually keep the rooks connected while you actually employ this maneuver with queen b1. And queen b1 is excellent prophylaxis with a hint of attacking potential, because the idea in a lot of positions is actually to put the queen on a1 where it exerts tremendous pressure down this diagonal, and also even helps to sometimes blockade the d4 square. And so queen b1 is actually a really nice move, getting out of the way of the rook, which eventually was going to try and come to c8 and challenge that queen, and also entertain some attacking ideas potentially on the long diagonal. Now, another move that I'd actually consider in this position was actually queen f5. Sorry, let me do that arrow better. Was queen f5, because a lot of times this is actually quite a thematic maneuver in these lines. And if you actually had seen my white game from the previous round against Vincent Say, you saw that I actually played this queen f5 maneuver to kind of get my queen closer to black's king side and put pressure on his position. And it's remarkable how when that queen gets to f5, sometimes the position starts to collapse, because it's very difficult for the bishop on b7 to come back around and contest the queen in time, while the queen actually is very annoying, eyeing the d5 pawn, and in some lines even provoking g6, which just further weakens the dark squares and opens up the bishop to attack on the long diagonal. So very, very important move that sometimes is playable, but queen b1 is also very, very strong. So anyways, the thing that I now have to worry about in a lot of lines is just the d5 pawn. In many positions, my whole justification for the setup was, well, my d5 pawn is not going to be hanging because tactically my rook would be lined up against the queen. But now that's not actually the case, and white's next move could very well be knight h4 or knight d4, both of which uncover the bishop on the long diagonal against b7 and entertain jumping to this really nice f5 square and attacking the d5 pawn in the process. So my position is already kind of critical. After queen b1, I played the move bishop b4 because I'd kind of recognized just how critical it was, and I figured I needed to get pressure on the c3 knight before things went really south. White now played the move knight d4, and I was kind of, this is actually a really good move, blockading the pawn, entertaining knight f5 still. But I was actually kind of happy to see this because I was a little bit more worried about knight h4 just because the pawn on d5 would be attacked right away. And I wasn't convinced that, you know, giving up the bishop pair to win the e2 pawn was very good. Now I could play, again, bishop takes c3, and rook takes e2. And I am a pawn up, but I was very skeptical that it would actually be worth it to go for this type of position when white has the two bishops and a knight coming to f5. And it reminded me of a game that I think Kasparov played with white against someone else in the semi-terrace a long time ago, where black actually grabbed the e2 pawn, gave up the bishop pair, but actually lost kind of spectacularly because white's remaining pieces were so well placed, and the pawn on d5 wasn't something that could be really well mobilized. So I thought knight h4 was something I would be more worried about, and I like knight d4 at least because now the d5 pawn is not under fire. So anyways, now that actually gave me time to play the move rook c8, and you could see here I'm actually attacking the c3 knight, so white has to do something about that. And white played the very, very good move queen a1. And yeah, white's pieces right now are all extremely harmonious. Everything's protected. White has an excellent pawn structure. Just a lovely, lovely position from an aesthetic perspective. And this knight on d4 is ready to jump into f5 and spring to life. And I probably should have stopped that idea. The computer was recommending g6, and I'd seen g6, but I didn't want to rush with it. I thought that it'd be better to play g6 when the knight is actually there. And I kind of underestimated that the knight on f5 can actually go to even better square after landing on f5. So g6 would have been important just to stop the maneuver that actually wound up happening in the game. I started with the move bishop f8, and basically my point was that when knight f5 comes on the board, and it did come now, I thought now I could play the move g6 and actually force that knight to go back, and I was like, oh, I gained a tempo, this must be good for me. But actually in this position, white played the move knight e3, and here I recognized just how poor my position was, because essentially now there's actually 1, 2, 3, 4 attackers on my pawn on d5, and they're just 2 defenders. So there's no way I can, cover up the pawn on d5 anymore. And then the other problem is that I can't actually, give up the pawn for anything because my bishop on b7 is just hanging. And so I have multiple problems, and the d5 pawn looks like it's just lost. The other issue is now that the knight went to e3 instead of back to d4, this diagonal is wide open for the bishop and queen battery. And so all of white's pieces are just harmoniously placed, and white is very, very nearly winning. In fact, white is winning. Now, the first move I looked at just to check was the move d4. I thought that would be kind of a funky move because after bishop takes b7, maybe d takes c3, or no, sorry, d takes e3 would be an interesting line, at least ruining white's pawn structure a little bit and getting some play on the dark squares. But actually, what dawned on me is that after d4, white doesn't have to take on b7. They can just play rook takes d4, and I still have pretty much all the problems that I had in the previous position, and I'm a pawn down. Because after bishop takes g2, white can play knight takes g2, and again, there's this problem where my knight on d7 is pinned, these rooks are about to be doubled, and the diagonal here is exposed because I've played g6. So just a world of pain here, and no compensation to speak of. So once I realized that d4 is not an option, moving the knight to one of these squares isn't really an option because d5 drops. To me, there is only one way forward in this position, and I've been kind of thinking about this move from a while back because there are some positions where this is a thematic sacrifice in the semi-terrace. Excuse me, not in the semi-terrace, in the normal terrace. But yeah, here I just saw no other choice than to go rook takes e3, and this move is not. This move should not save me. It's a nice move to play. A lot of people around me after the game thought it was a really brilliant decision, but it was really more out of desperation than out of some type of brilliance because there was just nothing else I could do. So what am I getting for the exchange sacrifice? Well, for one, after f takes e3, I'm ruining white's pawn structure. So the king is a little bit more exposed than it was a move ago. And a lot of times when white has fianchettoed the bishop, the exchange sacrifice is doubly more powerful because the pawns are actually the remaining pawns are all pretty weak. So there's sometimes a way to undermine the g3 pawn with h5, h4. There's also ways to undermine e3 with knight g4 and bishop c5. And that was mainly what I was pinning my hopes on, was pressure on this diagonal with those combination of pieces. Now, the problem for me in this position is I have currently no pawns for the exchange. So it's not like I netted material in addition to the sacrifice exchange. It's just I'm 2 points down. And the other issue is that I still haven't quite solved the problem of this really weak d5 pawn. And so it appears that it's still going to drop. Now, the last thing that's really problematic is the rook on f1 now actually is another attacker against my knight on f6. So all of a sudden now the threats against f6 are even stronger than they were a move ago. But I do have some counterplan. That's something I couldn't say in previous positions. I now played the move queen e7. And this was actually the product, of a lot of calculation because it was really pretty much the only move in the position that really generated counterplay. The huge problem for me was if I played a move like knight g4, just attacking e3 right away, knight takes d5 pretty much won on the spot because it not only protects the e3 pawn, it also threatens knight f6 check, and the problem is my knight on d7 is pinned to my queen on d8, and pieces are just hanging everywhere. And the other sad fact in the position, if I play bishop takes d5, trying to take on e3 next, well, after bishop takes, knight takes, bishop takes f7 is actually mate. So I can't even begin to win the exchange back. I kind of have to batter down the hatches, and that's why queen e7 is such an important move, because it gets out of the way of the rook on d1. It still entertains queen takes e3 check, and it also holds the f7 pawn in certain positions. So anyways, after queen e7, white played the move knight takes d5, and now I played the move knight takes, and then after bishop takes d5, I played queen takes e3 check. Now, I actually should back up for a moment because bishop takes d5 was played, and it's a very, very fine move and doesn't spoil anything. But rook takes d5 was also an attractive option because, again, in a lot of these lines, if I recapture on d5 with my bishop, f7 is really too weak. And so if rook takes d5, I'd have to go queen takes e3, king h1, and actually rook c2. And this is actually a line I, believe it or not, had seen and thought that I'd have enough compensation here. But you can see that my position is hanging by a thread because I have to be very concerned about this f7 pawn. Remarkably here, though, in this particular variation with rook takes d5 and rook c2, black is actually completely fine. And the reason for this is because you can't actually take on d7 because now black is the one that's delivering checkmate very quickly, pretty much whatever white does. And so remarkably, it's one of these rare scenarios where the unprotected bishop on b7 is actually just as strong as the protected bishop on g2. Remember that discussion before about bishops on the same diagonal. Typically the dynamic is in the favor of the one that's actually protected, but here it's actually not. After rook c2, white would actually have to play bishop f3 to stay in the game. And after rook takes e2, black is pretty much equalized because now you still can't take this rook on e2 because bishop takes d5 check. And now having a pawn for the exchange and really, really active piece on the second rank, black should probably hold this. So, yeah, so white made the correct decision playing bishop takes d5. And I played queen takes e3 check. And now Michael played rook f2. And this move needs to be played because if you move the king, then I can actually take on d5 and play queen e4 check and actually skewer the king and the rook. Let me just show you what that looks like. Boom. And this would be double trouble. So, yeah, rook f2 is the only move. And, yeah, for the moment it seems that white's position is actually just a tiny bit awkward because of this pin and because the queen maybe on a1 is a little bit out of play if you don't get any attack going here. And so I have to be very, very precise, though, to try and cause some problems to white here because, again, white is just two points up, essentially, a full exchange up for nothing. So I do have to kind of, just keep playing with a lot of energy to make use of this, because as soon as white consolidates, my position is just in tatters because I don't have enough material. So the immediate threat is just bishop takes f7 mate still, so I have to go bishop takes d5. And after rook takes d5, I played the move bishop c5. And my idea here was to get pressure on f2, again, before white can fully consolidate. And I actually felt pretty good here because it seemed like the position was not going to be losing in the next, 2 to 5 moves. A few moves back, my pawn on d5 was going to drop. There was heavy pressure with the knight on f5 and then on e3. But here it seems like at least black is the one that's putting the pressure on white's king for now, and I felt pretty good about that. Now, another move that's in the position, and the move that the computer seems to point out is actually playing knight c5. Knight c5 is arguably a slightly better move. Both moves, knight c5 and bishop c5, actually lose with best play. But I thought that knight c5 was actually easier to defend against because here white can actually just play queen f1. And now there's pressure against f7. Bishop d4 is also an idea, challenging the queen on e3. And not having my bishop on this diagonal, I think, was just not going to give me any chances. So I did play bishop c5 in part because I thought I would get some chances if I continued to try to attack. Note that rook takes d7 doesn't work because I have queen takes f2 check. And so white does have to address this issue right now. So the only way to do that actually is to play the move bishop d4. And yeah, this is a move that's quite obvious and one that I calculated. And after bishop d4, I played the move queen e6. And I kind of got up from the board and thought that everything was fine. I thought that I'd solved my problems because I thought here that the rook on d5 was just trapped. Obviously, there are no squares E5 and F5 aren't great. H5 is covered. And I thought rook G5 would just be way too awkward to be good. I can actually just go H6. And again, the rook is actually just trapped. There are no squares on the 5th rank it can go to. But then I actually returned to the board, and I'd actually realized that the rook isn't trapped on D5 because of a pawn move that I just completely overlooked, and it's the move E4. And once I saw E4, I was actually quite frustrated because I realized that I hadn't equalized. Again, for some reason, I thought that white would have to play rook takes c5 here and give the exchange back. And then, of course, I shouldn't really be worse than this type of position. I mean, not at all. But I just missed this e4 move, and it's a remarkable move to miss because it's just right in front of your face. But I think it's because I was calculating this line from a while away back, and I just had missed this detail. Now, after e4, I kind of had to regroup and figure out how to keep my counterplay going. Because now, if white just manages to get these bishops off the board and nullify the pressure on this diagonal, I am, again, a full exchange down. And so I decided to play the move bishop a3. Because I thought that this at least kept the pressure on. I don't trade the bishops, and I threaten rook c1 check. Now, white does have a draw at his disposal if he wants it with the move bishop b2, but of course it's understandable why this type of repetition would not be attractive when you're a full exchange up. And full credit to Michael for continuing to try to find the best moves here, because obviously he should. I mean, he shouldn't take a draw in a position where, you know, he's actually a full exchange up and, you know, just needs to play a few moves to offset my initiative. And so, yeah, he continued to play quite accurately. And after my bishop a3 move, he actually played the move bishop e3, which is very, very strong and just a very, very good move. You actually cover the c1 square, so there's no mating, there's no threatening to win the queen here. And you also ensure that queen takes c4 isn't really possible still, because if I go queen takes e4, it runs into queen d4, and essentially the queens have to come off the board or I lose a knight. And yeah, if the queens come off the board, then it's much easier for white to convert. And so, yeah, bishop e3 is just a very, very effective move, and white is indeed winning in this position. White does have a winning position, but it's not the easiest position in the world to convert, in part because the king is a little bit exposed because the f2 pawn is gone, and the fact that the e4 pawn is actually can't really be pushed very easily because I have good control on the e-file and my knight is eyeing the e5 square, so it's difficult to mobilize any of white's pawns. And then you also have to be a little bit careful about this diagonal. So it's not the easiest position in the world to convert, but it is winning. So anyways, my initial attacks, didn't really work, and so now I kind of just have to consolidate my position, because another white idea is sometimes to play bishop h6 here and actually threaten queen g7 mate. And so to kind of batter down that hatch and stop that threat, I decided to play the move bishop e7. And my idea here was to entertain actually getting my bishop to a new diagonal from which it can exert some influence, but also entertain f6 in some positions if need be. Now, the computer actually suggests the move bishop f8 is more effective, just stopping bishop h6 altogether. But the reason I didn't really like this is I thought that my bishop here might be a little bit passive, and I saw some circumstances where I wouldn't get to play knight f6. And so a lot of positions with bishop e7, I thought the benefit is not only am I threatening bishop f6 sometimes, but I'm also threatening knight f6, attacking the rook on d5, entertaining knight g4, which would be a very annoying fork, and also sometimes eyeing the e4 pawn. And bishop f8 didn't really do that. But the computer's plan with bishop f8 is actually after rook f1 to go h5. And this is another point of why white's pawn structure is kind of sensitive and the win isn't so easy, because I can start to undermine white's kingside pawns right away with the move h4. And again, this would not be something that was possible if there was a pawn in f2. But instead I played bishop e7. And now Michael played bishop h6 very quickly, correctly gauging that, provoking f6 is probably a good idea because I weaken my whole 7th rank, and then maybe the f6 pawn is something that I have to tend to. So it's a very, very legit idea. And I played f6 very quickly because, again, I didn't want to allow queen g7 mate, but I also thought that if I put my knight or my bishop there, it would actually kind of be pinned because I'd have to worry about that mate. So bishop f6 was possible, but I thought a move like queen d1 would be really problematic for black because now in a lot of lines, my knight on d7 is actually hanging because if I move it away, there's sometimes tactics connected to rook d8 and mate that start to work out. Now, in this position, I'm not so sure that's the case because my bishop is covering the square, but these are just things I was thinking about, is the rook, the queen lined up against d8, the bishop taking away my escape squares. Just a very unpleasant position to defend. So anyways, I played f6, and now white actually took a step in the wrong direction. And I must credit Michael because for the last pretty much 10 moves, or 5 to 8 moves after my exchange sacrifice, he's actually played all the first or second choice moves. He's played very, very effectively. He's consolidated the position pretty well, and the only thing that's left to do is to just make sure that you batter up the hatches just a little bit more. And unfortunately, the consolidating attempt that Michael tried here is actually just a mistake. Now, the best move in the position is actually the move rook e2. And you might consider this to be super, super obvious, but it's not so clear when there's so many decent choices. Or not so many, but there were a lot of decent looking choices, and I can understand why Michael played the move that he played. The reason that rook e2 is actually strong is because not only are you protecting e4, but you're also getting out of the way of pressure on this diagonal, and of potential forks with knight g4, which were kind of coming up with the knight coming to e5. And that was actually really important to kind of do that prophylactically, get the rook away from the knight, which is planning to jump to g4. Unfortunately, Michael played the move queen d1, and now the position isn't even better for white, amazingly. Even though white is actually just a full exchange up, black actually has enough consolidation in this position to just equalize the game and really actually play for something. And part of the reason for that is because of my next move, knight e5. As you can see from the arrows, all of a sudden I have multiple threats in the position. My knight is threatening knight g4, my bishop is threatening to go to c5, and because of these threats, it's really difficult to guard everything. And the real issue is that bishop e3, which stops bishop c5 ideas, walks into knight g4, and so you can't actually play bishop e3. And if you play rook e2 now, rook e2 looks extremely natural. That actually runs into some other problems with g5, and the bishop on h6 is actually trapped. And so because of those problems, black is actually totally fine. After knight e5, white decided to play rook fd2, but actually it just doesn't solve white's problem entirely. And I have this knight already in a really aggressive attacking post. I was wondering if there was any way I can drag the queen away from d1 to get a knight f3 check. And I actually for a moment considered knight g4 anyway, because it seemed to me with my knight coming to g4 and my bishop coming to c5 with tempo, that would actually be quite attractive. But I thought for a little bit longer, and then I realized that this bishop on h6 is actually so weak that I maybe should try and corral that. And that's why I played the move g5. And all of a sudden here, white is actually in huge trouble because the bishop on h6 is now lacking squares. And in one move, I also gave my king on g8 additional escape square, because in a lot of these positions, the only idea with the only idea or entry square that black had, or that white had with the Alekine's gun in this position, was actually rook d8, which would give back the exchange, but get some very nasty checkmating ideas with the queen coming to f8, and with my pawn back on g6, I wouldn't have been able to run away. So let's just say I did nothing. Let's say I made a move like a5. Now, after rook d8 check, if we take everything, this would be mate on f8. So actually, in one move, not only did I trap the bishop on h6, but I also gave my king an escape square if need be, and that was huge. So now actually the threat is just knight g4, just basically trying to win the bishop for nothing, or even better, knight f7, which actually covers the d8 square as well. And so white is pretty much in big trouble here and is obliged to play the move rook d8 check, which he did play. After rook d8 check, I had a decision to make, because I could elect to get the exchange back, or I could elect to do something else. So I did play bishop takes d8 first, so not the exchange back. Let me clarify my statement. After rook d8 check, I could decide whether to trade all the rooks and get to a position like that, or to try and run away with my king up the board. And that was kind of the tricky question for me, is what to do in that circumstance. Was it safe for my king to run up the board? Could I dance away on the light squares? I wasn't quite sure. So of course I played bishop takes d8 first. And now after rook takes d8 check, remarkably, the material is equal. And my knight on e5 is a monster, so I'm thinking about whether I can play this for a win. I'm thinking that, if the bishop on h6 is trapped a few more moves, the queen and knight is a very deadly combination. But the thing I was wondering here was whether I could actually run up the board with king f7 now, or whether I need to take on d8 first. I thought for a long time about this, and I really wasn't sure, and I decided to play the move king f7, walking with my king up the board instead of exchanging the rooks right away. And part of the reason for that is I wasn't comfortable with queen takes d8 and queen f8 check, and then my king going to g6, and then also having to go to h5 after queen g8 check. Remarkably, though, it turns out that rook takes d8 is actually the stronger move. And part of the reason for that is that after queen takes d8 check, king f7, if queen f8, chasing my king up the board as I feared, I thought here my king would actually be in danger of being mated. For some reason, I was really worried about king g2 in a lot of lines. So I was actually worried about something like this happening. But what I just completely underestimated is that white needs an additional move to play h3 and g4. And I actually have a move here which could prove hugely valuable with the move knight g4. And all of a sudden, I'm threatening queen takes e4 check, which would get the white king in a mating net. And I'm actually threatening knight takes h6. And for the moment, white actually has no checks. And so this position is actually completely winning if white chases my king up the board. And if you play queen takes h7, I can actually go queen d7, and this is the important detail, because I was afraid that if I go king g4 here, there's king g2, again, with h3 mate as an idea. But the point, remarkably, is that queen d7 here, which I would argue is a hard move to see from afar, actually nearly wins the game, because if you play bishop g7 check, now king g4, if you go king g2 in this version, my queen is in a position to actually deliver a check. And if I start delivering checks, it's going to be checkmate, because the queen and knight combination is so deadly. So that, let's just say king g1, queen e1 check, king g2, queen e2 check, king g1, and then knight f3 check, and then queen f1 mate. And so, remarkably, I play this move queen d7, which invites a discovery check, but there's just nothing that can be done after king g4. And in fact, the best move in this position is for white to actually trade the queens. But the problem here is that actually after knight d7, the bishop on g7 is still trapped. And so my king can actually take on f5 and then come back to g6 and try to collect the bishop. And again, it's still not clear here. White can actually play h4 and break out, but black would certainly be for choice, and I would argue that this endgame would be fairly difficult to hold, even though the bishop is a long-range piece and could, defend quite stubbornly. I think, black would win this one maybe like 7 or 8 times out of 10 in a practical game. So yeah, amazing stuff. It would have been more precise to actually take the rook on d8 and allow the queen to the 8th rank, but I was not having any of that. So anyways, I went king f7, and now white has another interesting choice, whether to go queen h5 check or actually trade the rooks on c8. White decided to play queen h5 check, and now I played the move knight g6 blocking. Now white actually played rook takes c8, and this was actually a mistake. Instead, the move bishop takes g5 should have been played. I actually had seen this line and seen that white could actually sacrifice a piece here. And the point is that if I take on g5, there's queen takes h7, and so I'd have to go rook takes d8, but here there's queen takes h7 check anyway, and the point is that white is actually picking up the knight on g6, so he's sacrificing an exchange, but getting a lot of checks in against my king, and really has quite a bit of compensation for it. And so after king f8, queen takes g6, I actually can't take on g5 because my queen is hanging, and now there's a very nasty threat of bishop h6 check or bishop takes f6. And here I'd have to go rook d4 to keep the balance. And yeah, we can have an endgame position on the board, for instance, after queen takes f6 and rook takes e4, where black is definitely for choice, even though the material is level and white does have 2 pawns for the exchange. Because the rook is actually just more mobile, I can actually attack some of these queenside pawns and try to actually corral one of them, although white isn't really losing. So, tricky line to see when you're in some time trouble, but bishop takes g5 would have been the better move. Instead, Michael played rook takes c8, and after queen takes c8, the problem that he has is that this bishop on h6 is still trapped. And now my queen is in a position where I can start really giving some serious checks and maybe picking up some pawns or some material. And so I thought that black was actually very close to winning here, even though the material is level, just because of the difference in the quality of the remaining pieces. After queen takes c8, Michael played queen d1. And this makes sense to me because you want to actually control some of the infiltration squares of the black queen. And now I played the move queen c5 check, just challenging this king on g1 right away, and also just further centralizing my queen. Instead, it would have been better to play the move knight e5. This move actually would have won kind of on the spot because I'm threatening the move king g6. But I actually rejected this one because of the move queen h5 check. And I thought here I would just have to go back with my knight because I didn't see any reasonable way to improve my king. If I move my king toward the middle of the board, I thought there might be some nasty check like queen h3, skewering my queen and king. And I was reluctant to have to play a move like g4 because then actually the bishop would be back in the game. But remarkably here, the best move in the position after queen h5 check is actually king g8. And this is a move that, really is shocking to me. But the point is that I get out of the way of any checks, and I still entertain my own threats. But the point is that my knight now being centralized on e5 makes a huge difference. And so if you play a move like h4 trying to break this pawn chain here, now I can actually go queen c5 check, and the collection of checks that I have ensures that I keep everything together. And then all of a sudden this move knight f7 comes on the board, which stops queen e8 mate, and actually targets the bishop on h6. And apparently the position is just winning. Very, very difficult to imagine, but the point is that even here, after h takes g5 and f takes g5, the bishop is still trapped, which means that the queen on h5 is still tied to the protection of this bishop on h6. Very, very strange, but it works. Instead, I didn't see that high-class retreating move, and queen c5 just seemed more natural to me. So after queen c5, king g2, now I actually played queen c6. And my idea here was that I didn't mind if queen d5 check came on the board and the queens came off, because I thought that the bishop still being trapped and my king still being very, very close to the g6 square meant that I'd be able to corral it before the pawn broke free with h4. It turns out here that queen d5 check is actually the best move, and it's actually not as clear as I thought, because in this position we get an endgame very similar to the one, the queen trade, the option that was aligned before, and I'm a pawn up, but these positions are actually tricky to convert because this bishop is a long-range piece. So, you know, white's actually not winning, but I would still say that black's not winning, but I would still say black would win this position maybe like 7 or 8 times out of 10. Anyways, white kind of agreed with that sentiment because Michael actually played the move queen e2. And I was happy to see this queen e2 move because it meant that all of a sudden white's position was very passive. And as soon as white is passive and is defending weaknesses, like he is now with the e4 pawn, I thought that it would probably be very, very difficult to hold, because now I don't have to worry about counterplay against my king. So now I just improved. I played the move knight e5, and now my knight is centralized, my queen is eyeing a critical weakness, and I'm threatening the move king g6, which actually just traps the bishop, or almost traps the bishop. Unfortunately, the bishop has f8, so it doesn't quite trap it, but I thought king g6 would be an idea in some positions. So white's in a tough spot. Of course, if you go queen h5 check now, I can actually go king e6, and that's one of the benefits of my queen now being on c6 and my knight on e5, is that these light squares from which white could actually check my king are actually covered. So that actually makes a huge, huge difference. So instead of queen h5 check, Michael played really the only move to get counterplay in this position. It's the move h4, trying to essentially liberate the bishop from this dungeon on h6. It's been there a while, hasn't it? I mean, it's been, several moves, maybe about 10 moves since the bishop got to h6, and it hasn't really done anything since. So, yeah, really, desperate to get it out there. Now, I recognize that if I took on h6, I would lose a little bit of if I took on h4, I would lose a little bit of the grip I had on the 4th rank. Note that in this position, I'm doing a great job of controlling the proceedings on the 4th rank and really making it difficult for white to really do anything. And so I didn't want to play g takes h4 because I thought in a position like this, not only is the bishop freed, but now the queen might have more scope for checks at a later date because the h7 pawn might be hanging once the bishop moves from h6. So instead, I tried to think about playing a move that kept the pressure on and also locked the bishop on h6. And remarkably, I found this move, which is the best move in the position, and it's the move king g6. And the point now is that in this position with the h4 move on the board, the bishop going to f8 is not as attractive because I can actually kind of create some type of light square bind. I can entertain the move g4, which is quite strong. And the problem here is that now the queen will never be able to traverse to these light squares, and I might consider something like knight f3. And the other thing is that I'm actually threatening f5, which actually pins the e4 pawn in a lot of positions and just causes great problems. In fact, after bishop f8, I can actually start with f5, and that might be even stronger now because if you play h takes g5, I can take on e4 first, and I think the ending is winning because if we have a trade like this and you try to protect the e7, the g5 pawn with bishop e7, after a move like knight g4, White's king can actually cross the plane on the third rank and actually challenge the e4 pawn. So yeah, so anyways, after the move king g6, White actually played h takes g5 first. And here I had another tricky decision to make, and this is actually move 38, so I don't have I just need a few moves to get to the time control. And I played the best move here, which is the move f5. And the whole point is to play against this bishop on h6. And so if I played f takes g5, White would get some counterplay here, potentially by playing a move like bishop f8, or maybe even queen well, not queen e3. The bishop is actually hanging. So bishop f8 would have to be played. But the difference here is that this king is actually a little bit safer than in positions where I play f5, because I haven't gotten pressure on the e4 pawn, and so the diagonal's not actually opening up. So it was hugely important to play f5 so that I continue to keep up the pressure on this e-pawn and open up the highway to the king. The other thing that's nice about this f5 move is it ensures that I actually can get a passed pawn potentially on the e-file, because if I play f takes e4, there's really no opponent on the e-file, whereas if I played f takes g5 here, the g-pawn has an opponent, and the h-pawn, which would be the extra pawn that I might have in the position to press, is actually the worst extra pawn you can have in the position, because it's the least mobile. It's just not the strongest pawn, right? Central pawns are better than flank pawns in most circumstances, and that's no different here. And so it's hugely important that the pawn that I create as my the threat in my position is a central pawn, and that's why f5 is so strong. Now, after f5, White actually played king f2, and here I'm on move 39, and I've got the desired outcome I want. I'm going to win the e4 pawn. It's a question of how to do it. I played the move f takes e4. The reason I did that is because I played queen takes e4. I thought White could capture and go king e3. And I wasn't too sure if these positions are winnable, because even though I get my king to f5, I wasn't sure I could nudge the king away if it could dart between e3 and d4. I didn't see a way I can position my knight to get it away from both of those squares. And so I thought keeping the queens on the board was smarter and kept all my options open. And now, after f takes e4, White played g4, and this move is pretty much kind of admitting that the position is lost, because it does not, change the situation in the center. I do have this, again, brilliant pawn on e4 now, and the combination of queen, pawn, and knight against just king and queen, because again, this bishop on h6 is just out of play, should be enough to win. But unfortunately here, I made a massive, massive blunder on move 40. And the move I played is knight d3 check. And it's just a massive, massive, massive blunder. Now, the move that would have won pretty much very quickly would have been the move queen c5 check. And this is the move I was looking at initially, because you can't block with queen e3 because of knight takes g4, forking the queen and king. So the king has to move away from the pawn. And then I just go queen d4. And this really subtle creeper move is very, very effective, because now I can actually push the e3. I can actually push the pawn with e3, or in some positions play queen d3 and just win the game. Here, White could try to play bishop f8 and get the bishop out, but now I can actually take the pawn on g5, and yeah, now I'm just a pawn up, have the queen and knight, and again, this passed e-pawn should win the day, particularly with the king on g2 being so weak. Unfortunately, though, my move knight d3 is totally moronic, and it really it was the product of me missing a very, very important detail. I think I was a little bit tired and fatigued, perhaps, because I thought I'd calculated all of White's potential replies, and of course, the one that you ask yourself first is, well, what if king e3? What if the king steps up in the position? And all of a sudden, when I got to this position, I realized that my calculation was wrong. What I'd looked at from afar was I thought that after queen c1, king takes c4, that I can actually fork the king and queen. And so I actually thought here, I know this is crazy, but I thought that I could play knight g3 check. Can you believe that? I thought my knight could move 3 squares up and deliver check. I cannot even explain it. I'm just telling you honestly that was the blindness that I had. And because of that, that's why I went for this line with knight d3 check, because I thought the king could not step up. And then once I got here, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have this check. And all of a sudden, the king is actually in perfect position to actually attack the pawn, because now my queen is actually stuck tied to the pawn. And if I try to check the king, then it can go to f4 or d4 potentially and attack it and just win it with the queen and the king. And so all of a sudden, after king e3, the position actually isn't winning because the king is actually too close to the e4 pawn for me to mobilize it. I played knight e5, at least, trying to keep an eye on g4 and maybe entertain some threats. But I'd recognized here what I'd done, because I'd spent like 15 minutes in the position pretty much just shaking my head and being disgusted with myself that I let it all slip from move 40. And in some ways I thought, hey, maybe this was just poetic justice, because Michael had been winning earlier in the opening and middle game. So maybe it was just some type of justice leveling the scales. But I was so frustrated that I'd done so much work to defend and then all of a sudden just ruined it. So anyways, after knight e5, White played king f4, and this is actually the problem. Is again, you could see the queen and the king effectively attack the pawn, and yeah, it's just very, very difficult to deal with. So I actually went knight d3 check again, and then after king e3, I went queen e6, and this was pretty much based on a stubborn determination not to repeat moves, because essentially I could have kind of shut the game down with a move like queen d5, and here white can actually trade queens. I take on g4, bishop f8 comes, and then after king takes g5, I'm a pawn up in this position, but it's going to end in a draw because this king can very quickly run towards the queen side and secure those pawns, and the bishop on d6 can actually sack itself for the pawn on h2 when needed. Just to illustrate, if bishop e7 check, king g6, king d5, king f5, king c6, knight f6, kind of a clever try blocking the bishop on this diagonal, but now the bishop will just go to the new diagonal because, yeah, it can actually just go to c7 and also ultimately just stop the pawn from queening, and yeah, the position would just be, the position is just a draw. So instead, I decided to try and keep some life in the position with my queen e6 move. Now, the reason this shouldn't win and really isn't even close to winning is because on a lot of positions, if the queens manage to come off the board, there's no life in the position, and a lot of times there are decent ways to do that. So one thing that I had to be worried about a lot was actually queen h2, which actually threatens queen h5 mate remarkably, because my king is kind of boxed in right now and doesn't really have many squares. And so I was always worried about the white queen landing on h5 or f5 delivering mate, and sometimes even g8. And so my idea with queen e6 was that at least for the moment I'm eyeing the g4 pawn, so if queen h2 is played, I can at least take the g4 pawn and give myself an escape square. And my knight on d3 is actually remarkably active, covering some of the entry squares that the queen would use to try and get into my position. And so I thought I wasn't running a major risk of losing, and if I wasn't running a risk of losing, maybe I could still try to play for the win. Now, the one caveat here is that I did waste pretty much 20 minutes coming to this winning attempt, and so all of a sudden I did not have a ton of time in my position, and I was pretty much in time trouble again, which is not a great thing that you want to happen when you're already kind of on tilt because the evaluation has changed. So I wasn't completely relaxed, and I was, trying to play for the win, which is always extremely, extremely risky. So anyways, after queen e6, white played the move queen g2. It's funny because the move queen h2 that I just showed you and I'd thought about during the game actually draws on the spot. Because after queen takes g4, queen d6 check, I can't escape the checks. And queen g2 basically told me that Michael was now playing for the win, because there are certain circumstances where if white actually wins the pawn on e4 and then runs the king towards the queen side, that maybe white could actually be the one that wins if I really botch it. So I still have to be careful here, and after queen g2, I actually played the move knight b4, which is a very, very tricky move, which really is also kind of just a tacit draw offer, because white could actually just trade the queens now by taking on e4, and would really just have to calculate the 2-on-1 that would ensue. So if queen takes e4 check, queen takes, king takes, knight takes a2, it appears that, okay, maybe black's up an extra pawn on the queen side, and this could be a little bit tricky. But honestly, it really isn't. My knight is a little bit trapped, and the king is too close to the queen side for this to really be a huge issue. And after king d4, a6, king d5, knight c1, b4, knight a2, and king c6, basically all the pawns come off the board really quickly, and then it just becomes a draw. And the king comes back easily in time to stop the pawn from queening. And that's another reason why, how I mentioned before, that the h pawn is really the rook pawn is the least valuable pawn you can have, because of scenarios like this. So yeah, so again, white just had a draw on their hands if they wanted it with queen takes e4. It would have required a bit of calculation, and Michael was also in some time trouble too. So this was, we were both in time trouble again. I think I maybe had like 5 more minutes than Michael did, but so it was like 15 to 10 or something like that, and no more extra time. So it was going to be a tricky finish. But yeah, this is something that definitely he probably could have calculated. Maybe he did calculate and just thought, I want more. Because after knight b4, he actually went for the move queen h2. And this move is actually very, very interesting, because it seems that black is actually in huge trouble. Now, the threat immediately is queen h5 mate. But the thing is that in previous in the previous line where queen h2 could have been played a move earlier, I was saying queen takes g4 was a move, and that after queen d6, and then I thought I'd be fine. But in this particular version, after queen takes g4, there's queen d6 check, which seems to just pick off the knight on b4, and so it seems like I'm in huge trouble because I'm going to lose a piece. Now you might say, well, what about attacking the king? What about playing a move like knight d5 check? Well, the problem is that if I go knight d5 check, white can actually just go king d4. And remarkably here, there are no more checks in the position, and white is still threatening mate. And so this would be a position where all of a sudden white would definitely be for choice, because I have no more checks, and all of a sudden these endgames where the queens come off the board could be extremely dangerous, because this king on d4 is so active. So yeah, very, very tough spot to be in. And I was running low on time. Once I saw queen h2 on the board, excuse me, I actually basically spent another like 5 minutes just trying to work out all the possibilities. And usually you just go by process of elimination when there aren't a whole ton of choices. So I said knight c2 check. Nope, that doesn't work. Knight d3. Nope, that doesn't work because queen h5 mate. And knight d5 check, I said, well, king d4 seems to be good for white. And so basically by process of elimination, I landed on the move queen takes g4 anyway. And honestly, I actually offered a draw after queen takes g4 because I thought that my position was quite precarious and that I wasn't really sure if I had a perpetual check or not. I felt I probably had a perpetual check, but my lack of confidence in whether I had one or not just led to me offering a draw because I recognize now that I'm losing a piece. And so after queen takes g4, queen d6 was very quickly played, and then I went king h5, and then queen takes b4 was played, and I'm just down a piece. I have a pawn for it, and fortunately for me, the bishop on h6 is out of play for the moment, but it seemed to me that, you know, I probably would be lucky if I hang on here, and I was just trying to find moves that best challenged black, or that best challenged white. So I started, of course, with the move queen f3 check. And my idea with queen f3 was that, you know, it's a check. It prevents white from winning the e4 pawn, and it forces the king to make a very difficult decision. Remarkably, though, it was not until I actually played the move queen f3 check that I realized just how tricky this position actually was. Because what I realized is that my e-pawn is actually kind of an asset, and my king on h5 is actually quite safe. White can't check the king in one move, and so I pretty much have two moves to get some type of initiative going before my king becomes under fire. And so this actually gave me a lot of confidence that there's probably no way I can lose this, and maybe on a really good day my e-pawn might be a factor. So I actually thought in this position that king d2 was the best move. Michael actually played the move king d4, and it's amazing. I'm not sure if he was actually able to fully calculate this, but king d2 would actually be a losing move. Remarkable. And the reason for that is because after e3 check and king c1, I thought this position would be just easily drawn. I thought that if I go e2, then queen e1 would be played, and with the white queen on e1 and the king coming to d2, that he'd be able to blockade the pawn. But what I'd missed was that there's actually queen f1 check. And the point is that I actually control the e1 square before the white queen gets there, and I also prevent the king from coming to the d file. And so after queen f1 check, king c2 has to be played, and now I actually go queen f2 check. And again, the king can't come to the d file because then there's e2 check. So if you go king d1, e2, and you stay on the d file, I have discovery check there and mate to follow. And so you actually have to go to d3, and now after e2, you actually can't stop me from queening. And so remarkably, if you retreat to d2, e3 check just wins because I have this resource with queen f1, and that's not something I saw over the board. And I do wonder if Michael saw it over the board, because it's a remarkable piece of calculation if he did. Instead, he correctly played the move king d4, and now I played the move queen d3 check. And I thought this was a really, really nice practical chance, because now the king has forced even further away from the direction where the e-pawn is going, and so queen trades now actually become quite dangerous, because after king e5, I played the move e3, and you can just imagine that if the queens came off the board for some reason, the white king is not in a position to actually catch up with the black pawn on e3. So all of a sudden I thought, hey, maybe I can actually win this one. It was in this position that white had to try and find one of the really precise ways to draw. And unfortunately for Michael, with only a minute left on his clock, he actually played a continuation that lost. Now I'll show you I'll show you a drawing continuation that would have held the game. There are two pretty effective ones. One is easier than the other, so I'll show you the easier one first. The easier one, in my opinion, is actually the move bishop g7, and the point is that if I go e2, now there's the move king f4 in this position, and the point is that the bishop gets to c3 in time, essentially once the bishop's on c3 and this battery's established, there's no way that I can queen the pawn or even hold the game for that matter. White would actually be winning in that particular version. So instead, after bishop g7, I'd have to play queen d7, attacking the bishop on g7. But now white could play queen f8, defending that bishop, and then after e2, can go queen f3 check. And this is a repetition that would be enough to hold the game. The harder way, you might actually consider this one kind of hard because maybe queen f8 is a tricky move to find. But the point is you defend the bishop and you threaten perpetual check. And if you're able to get in the perpetual, you get it. Now, the harder one to find after e3 is actually the move g6. And this is a move I think would be very, very tricky to find over the board with just a minute left because you're just seem to be giving up your bishop, you know, for nothing. But the point is that actually g6, you know, has a threat. It's threatening to push the pawn to g7 or g8 to queen, and I can't play e2 because, again, bishop d2 gets the bishop and the queen onto the diagonal where it's covering the e1 square, and so I need to take the bishop on h6. But after king takes h6, now white has g takes h7, and after king takes h7, king f4. And here, white will be able to play queen e7 check and essentially get a perpetual. So if I go e2, queen e7 check, king g6, queen e6, and you can see here my king can't escape up the board, and so this position would just be a draw. So those are the two ways to draw. I'm curious to see what you think, which one you think might have been a little bit easier to find, because Michael played the move king f4. And this move, unfortunately, for Michael, loses in a very, very brilliant way. So I'll leave it to you. Black to move and win in this one. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try to figure out what the winning continuation is. It turns out that the winning move, drumroll, which I did find, was the move queen d2. And the kind of cruel reality here is that the queens can't be traded because then after e takes d2, I just queen on the next move. And with the queen on d2, I'm not only controlling the queening square on e1, I'm actually threatening a discovered check on the king on f4. And so it's actually just completely lost. White tried to play the move queen e4, which at least entertains some checks of his own. But the problem is that after e2 check, the king actually doesn't really have shelter. White played king f5, trying to at least maintain some threats in the position, because now if I queen, that would be a major, major mistake. If I queen here, white could play queen g4, and all of a sudden it's white that's giving checkmate. And so the task for me now was to defend this checkmate, but actually, more specifically, try to queen my pawn without giving white any checks. And so I thought for a little bit. I had like 5 minutes left on my clock here, and I was able to find the right continuation in just about 40 seconds. And the move is queen d7 check. And the problem for white here is that wherever the king goes, the queens are actually forced off the board. And so in this position, Michael actually resigned. So let me just show you what the possibilities are. So if king f4, clearly queen g4 check gets the king and the queen off the board, and then after I trade, I make a new queen. And the same goes for king e5. The same goes for king e5 in this position. Sorry, after queen d7 check, king e5 here, because now I have queen e7 check, forcing the king and queen off the board, and then queening my pawn. But the real question, the reason I spent 40 seconds on this move and not 5 seconds on it, is king f6. And the point here is that I actually have the very sneaky queen d6 check. And the point is that wherever the king goes, whether it's f5 or f7 or even g7, I'm actually going queen g6 check, forcing off the queens. And so if king f7, queen g6 check, the queens come off, and then this bishop on h6, which is dormant for the latter half of the game, is not in time to stop me from queening my pawn. So yeah, very, very remarkable game. Very, very wild finish, and an unusual promotion tactic. I hadn't really had a position where I'm a piece down, but I'm promoting with tempo a lot of times, and this queen d2 move was the key move that that gave me the win, albeit it was a game full of errors, and you know, white was winning in the early middle game, and then I turned the tables, and I was winning in the end game, but then I messed it up, and then it was a draw, and then somehow I was winning again. So chess is a human game at times, and you know, sometimes that makes it more exciting, right? Because we can see the ups and downs, the ebbs and flows, and fortunately for me, it ended in my favor. With this win, I actually had won 3 in a row. So this was actually a really, really remarkable recovery, you know, since I'd actually had 3 draws from rounds 2 to 4. So now to, you know, basically have 3 wins from round 5 to 7 put me back right at the top of the leaderboard. So I felt pretty good going into the last 2 rounds. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.